All right, welcome. Welcome back to GPS. And I'm excited because I've been waiting a week to get a couple questions into the system here. So thank you for being with us. We are in the book of Revelation. It's God's prophetic surprise. We try to always mention our website. We're glad to have you communicate with us back and forth if you're following along. And if something is not clear or we slid over something or we're just wrong, please send us a message and say, I think, and we'll try to rectify it. So we are GPS at LLBN.tv. GPS at LLBN.tv, and we'll try to respond, or we'll talk about it on the air. So we're coming back to the second seal in Revelation chapter 6, where the fiery red horse has gone out. And we talked a little bit, and you said to hold that thought, so I've been holding it a week, John, on taking peace from the earth. So if I understand correctly, you are suggesting that the first, the white horse is Jesus and the gospel going out in the first century. And then the other horses begin to be the reaction to that. And this horse, when people don't accept the gospel, then they miss out on the peace. Mm-hmm. But the phrase says to take peace from the earth. So the default would sound like they have peace and then it's taken from them. But people who have never heard the gospel and then they hear the gospel and don't accept it, they never had it. So am I pushing that too far, or is it something where there is peace and then you take it away? They have salvation and then they lose it.
No, that's helpful. If you're thinking of the people in these horses as, just faceless pagans, etc., that's not what this is about. These are people who have heard the gospel, all right? Most of whom have actually at one point embraced it. But when the gospel loses its force, when they begin to reject, and when it comes to believers, that rejection can be very subtle. But when that happens, two different ways that peace gets taken away. One is the civil war within the church between those who have a clear understanding of the gospel and those who have another gospel. And you see Paul talking about that. They came with another gospel from Jerusalem or wherever. So the division in the church, the civil war within the church, is one way that peace is taken away. But I think we've also seen here the images of persecution. And that is when people believe they're serving God, but they go around persecuting, killing people who embrace the gospel. And this is also a way that peace is taken away from the earth.
This is a crazy story. I don't know if you remember, we had the whole debate over the white lie and the white truth. How many years ago? 30 years ago. So somebody had set up a book table outside the Oregon campground in Gladstone, Oregon. I don't know if you've been there, but anyway, it's where I was a young pastor. So here is this whole table of books, and a man came out at 9 o'clock, having just heard a sermon with 10,000 people under the tent and got the gospel, and he comes out and he sees this guy selling these books, and he gets so mad, goes over and hits him in the face, just blasts him. Just came out of church. But thinking he is now defending truth and standing for the right. And he justifies hitting someone in the face. Too bad. Too bad. Too bad.
Well, that recalls to me the Pool of Bethesda story, where a man is healed by Jesus. And then when Jesus finds him again outside the temple, he says to the man, "Stop sinning or something worse will happen to you." And that term, "stop sinning," the force of it in the original is stop doing what you're doing and have been doing these 38 years. In other words, this man had been sinning in his mind. A paralytic can't rob banks, or rape anyone or so on. So the sin that we're talking about was mental. Here, Jesus interacted with a person. Jesus healed the man. He's grateful to Jesus, all the rest of that, but he's still messed up psychologically. And sometimes people will receive the gospel, but they still are filled with anger and struggles, and it takes time. The healing process takes time. One of the metaphors for the gospel is healing. And Jesus is the great physician, and he wants to heal us, but he heals us to the degree that we're willing to let him work.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also hard because we are so good at holding people accountable for the shallow things, like the obvious things or the appearance things or whatever. But very often we don't know how to handle the things that are more subtle or trapped in our own heads. And I think that's a huge challenge within Christianity, because we can list off things people are doing wrong all the time, but they're all like the appearance version of things. Like, you appeared to have been doing something wrong, or like you robbed a bank, that can't be allowed, right? But the other stuff, we don't address that because mental health and all the things in our heads are so scary to us that we don't know. We don't know what to do with that.
If you want to get over sloppy dressing, you'll find plenty of help in church. A lot of people ready to support you, and
That's
all
probably
this
what
and
I
that.
need.
But if you are struggling with an addiction,
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
church people often going the other way. In other words, the really serious issues often do not get helped in church, and that's a real challenge.
Yep.
I've used the phrase, as sanctification. We're all in a process of sanctification, and maybe someone's at 40% that has been given over to God, and 60% is still pretty human, and then 50, 60. But that part of us that's not sanctified, Satan can still use and do damage. And that's why we think if I come to work, go to school or work at a Loma Linda or a La Sierra or in a church, and I expect it to be different. No, these people are still in process. And Satan can do damage with all of us. They assume, pastors, that we're at 100%. No, we're not 100% yet. We're probably closer than anyone else. But
I pointed at you. I want you to notice that.
There are exceptions there.
yes. And we just have to understand that. We're on the way. And God is still working with those areas of us. Now, off camera, we've talked a little bit about, and we've nibbled at this issue. These verbs are very active verbs, that God is now sending angels and pouring out vials and opening up seals, and these living creatures, and things happen, it seems to be at the initiative of God. And we were wrestling with an article that you were referring to. Someone had implied that maybe God knows everybody perfectly and addresses himself to each person's psychology and stage where they are with different metaphors and different verbs. And he allows himself to be portrayed with active verbs for one group of people, while later he may change those verbs and be more passive. He's allowing. Does that make sense, or
Yes.
How do you go with that?
Yeah, well, we looked at the text that talks about the gospel being like an odor that goes out, but the same smell smells different to different people. That's, applying that metaphor to the gospel. So it's not that God says, okay, we're going to save these people or we're going to destroy those, so you guys don't get to listen to the gospel. No. The gospel is available to all, but how people respond is the crucial difference. So, when somebody ends up on the dark side of things at the end, that was a choice that they made.
Because is God shaping it? Is God willing to use verbs that are maybe less than fully accurate? I guess is where the question is. I was thinking about, I teach leadership in ethics class. And we talk about situational leadership theory, where everybody, if you can have 4 or 5 different styles that are in your repertoire, and if you can be servant leadership or if you can be collaborative, that's the ideal. But there are times for dictatorial, when Rudy Giuliani sees 2 buildings that are going down, there's not much time for collaboration and discussion and negotiation. Get the responders there, get the fire trucks, get up in the building, bring these people out. And you have to be able to move depending on the situation and the people you're talking to. Is God flexible in that way? And does he say, I do it with one group of people at that stage? And does he say, no, it's not really me doing it, I'm just allowing it, but it's him doing it at another stage?
So you're saying God is okay with being misunderstood in order that he can get at least part of the message across?
Yeah.
I think
And
that's true.
may even say some things that we would know later to be less than fully truthful. But it's what needed to be said at that time in order to move people from here to here.
Well, Sarah just took half the air out of the room, but you interrupted her, and so you didn't get it out. So.
Well, it's not a really consequential thing. But what I was going to say is these metaphors, like every metaphor breaks down a little bit. But I think my only frustration with the some people smell the aroma and it's positive, and some smell and it's negative. Like, I don't like mushrooms; they kind of freak me out, so I choose not to eat them, and I prefer. Yeah, I think we're all on the same page here, so we can start an anti-mushroom club. But the challenge then is that we all have different taste buds. So for me, I don't enjoy them. I don't enjoy the texture, whatever. And someone else, that's like all they want. They want mushrooms and everything. And so in that sense, we all, like, some people like certain smells of perfumes and other people don't, but neither of them are bad. It's just that we react differently to them. Some of them don't smell good. So with that argument, then it's kind of murkies up the water a little bit, because then does that mean that they're rejecting the gospel, or do they just have a different taste bud per se? And then what do you do with that? Because if it's not something that they're going to enjoy or like or be, is there another thing out there for them, or are they just kind of set up for failure?
Got to keep in mind that mushroom preferences in the gospel are at a slightly different level of significance. Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying with that kind of metaphor of the gospel and like preference and.
Yeah. No, definitely. You make a good point. Metaphors are metaphors, and they can be taken too far. But I think Paul is just trying to say that people do divide over the gospel. And one way to describe it is the sense of an odor, but there are other metaphors that you could use. So I think the reality is we like to talk about the gospel as a positive, yet at the same time the gospel does bring us into judgment, because in a real sense, when we say no to the gospel, we're saying a no to a lot of things, including ultimately our own existence. High stakes.
I guess I could go on that for a while.
It seems to me it's a different question, and maybe that's why I'm not on the same wavelength yet. Is the issue just the response, or is the issue at God's own revelation of himself? He has a variety. It's not one gospel that he is putting out there. He is giving a range of gospel, and he calibrates his presentation of himself based upon the people.
Well, and that's right. And I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I mean, at the same time, to push an awful metaphor even further, I like the green bean casserole with mushroom soup in it. That's good to me, right? And so it's a different version of mushrooms, and for some reason I really enjoy it, and I'll eat that all day long. And so again, the question is what is it in the gospel? Is it the gospel itself, or is it the way we're presenting the gospel, or is it, what is the breakdown of that? And I think because I'm watching more and more.
But it's not a right or wrong in which way the mushrooms get put together. With this, there is a right or wrong. There is a truth about God. Does he shout and yell and do violence, or does he not?
Right.
Well, I want to pick up Sarah's point, because people sometimes say, Muslims, they're all lost because they've all rejected Jesus. And I said, wait a minute.
They have not.
I said, if the only Jesus you ever knew is the one whose cross is on a shield of a crusader who's about to lop your head off, if that's the only Jesus you've ever heard, rejecting him might be the best way to accept him.
Right. Well, and that's my question.
Because you're saying, if that's Jesus, I don't want any part of it. And Jesus is up there saying, amen, one of my guys.
Yeah. Well, and that's my struggle, is I'm watching more and more of my friends not care about anything that we're talking about at all. It's nothing. They don't hate it and they don't love it. They're just over it. And so at that point, my question is, what is the gospel message actually doing? And who is it actually for? Because we say it's for everyone, right? But a lot of these people have been emotionally abused by the gospel message. And so then how can you hold them accountable and pin them down and say oh, you're lost for all eternity because you're rejecting the gospel message? But the gospel message has never been presented to them in a palatable manner. And so then...
Then the question becomes, could they have found it on their own? and chose not to.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, God will not be left clueless,
Yeah.
regardless of what happens. But I think the beauty of evangelism and witnessing is that if it's done well, it can enhance a person's chance of making the right choice.
Right.
If it's done poorly, it can make it worse. So there's the smell again both ways. The gospel can smell bad because the giver of the gospel stinks, if you don't mind the carrying the metaphor too far. So sometimes the gospel is rejected because it has been poorly presented or portrays a God who is truly ugly and that we would not want to follow. Sometimes the gospel is rejected because the person receiving it has made certain decisions and choices in their life that predispose them to reject the real thing when it comes. And that's why I'm glad we don't do the judgment.
Oh, yeah.
Because God's the only one that can sort all of that out.
Yeah. I agree. We can.
Well, and I'm happy the way the thread has gone, but it was a different thread than where we started.
Yeah.
The thread we started was, does God do these things? Do we want to go back to that? Or
I believe
really
God,
not what we
I
want to
believe
cover?
God does at times use violence, and an example of that would be World War II, where violence there was used in order to save life. And when you think of the 6 million Jews, and there's another one, if the only Jesus you knew is your Nazi master, rejecting him would be the biggest acceptance Jesus ever got. So I would not be quick to judge people who have been fed a very ugly version of God. But the reality is that God sometimes uses violence to forestall greater violence, violence to save the oppressed. And when a person is about to be, you know, if you got somebody walks in with a machine gun and is gunning people down, and you say, God, help me, you're hoping that God isn't up there saying, oh, I don't use violence, so just hang in there and do the best you can with the situation. No. When God does intervene, he sometimes intervenes forcefully for the sake of saving people who mean a lot to him.
So we would say that many times in the Bible, when it says God does it, he said it means allow. But there are some times when it is actually God. And he has initiated evil, he initiated some suffering in order to relieve people from other suffering, or it would be worse if he didn't intervene.
I realize there are people who don't buy that both directions. You have people who say anything goes wrong, it's part of God's plan. You know, and there are other people who say, no, God never, ever, ever uses violence. There's always a natural explanation. It's always a consequence, etc. I think the truth may be somewhere in between. I mean, why pray to God for deliverance if he never delivers? You know, so at some point, God does intervene at significant points to save people, to rescue people, and so on. But most of the time, he tends to allow freedom and the outworking of free choices. And sometimes the outworking of someone else's free choice is not good for me.
Okay?
And that happened a certain Friday in Jerusalem, didn't it?
Yeah.
When the outworking of some people's choices was devastating to Jesus on the cross, and the Father did not intervene. Could have. He said, I could have called, what was it, 6 legions of angels, you know? But he didn't. I guess it was 12, actually. He doubled up.
Yeah. Okay, enough on that.
Sure.
I agree with every word you said on that.
Should we ride
on that,
another
Jon.
horse?
All right.
Moving on.
So here we are with the second horse. We've talked about the issue of taking peace from the earth. We've wrestled with the issue of violence, of God allowing this war and death to happen. Now we are
I'll
ready
say one
for...
more quick thing about the second horse, and that is that the persecution theme just means that those who receive the gospel, those who are right with God, rarely look like winners in this earth. In other words, you cannot judge whether a person's right with God by how prosperous they are, by even though Proverbs says, you know, if you follow God, you'll prosper. If you don't, things go bad. But in this life, things aren't fair. And the people of God rarely look like winners in this life, and that's the norm. We should not be surprised at that. We should not be disappointed at that. We, in one case, the scriptures say we're appointed to suffer.
Okay, ready for number 3?
Yeah.
You get your Bible or text out, and here we go, Revelation 6, starting with verse 5. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand, and then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine."
As I've pointed out before, if you go to verse 2, you see that the white horse went out, conquering and to conquer. If you go to verse 3, it says, a red horse went out. But you look at this one, and it says, I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And so there's no reference to going out. So there is a distinction. There's a couple of pairs here. You have the first 2 horses, the white and the black, which do go out, so their effects are felt all over the earth. In fact, the first rider's effects are continuous until the end of time, very clearly stated. So these 2 horses affect everything all the time. Horses 3 and 4 seem like super disasters that are perhaps more occasional. They don't go out the way the first 2 horses did.
And typically this is called famine.
Yeah.
They say the 3rd horse is famine. Where did they get the famine?
Well, whenever in ancient times bread was the cheapest food, wheat was one of the, and barley were among the most abundant of crops. And when people became
Even now you go
sedentary.
anywhere, you can get naan or chapatis or something.
Sure, yeah. So bread was the cheapest food. When bread was weighed out, that was a sign of a severe famine. So here you have the weighing out of bread. And look at the totals. The Greek word is denarius. It says a quart of wheat for a denarius. As your translation said, Dan, a denarius is a day's wage.
So you're working just to eat.
So, you know, let's just say a working class person spends a day working, gets, say, $200 US dollars, all right? Loaf of bread, $200, enough to feed himself.
So no housing, no clothes, no anything else, just, or your family, feed
A
yourself.
quart of wheat was about enough to feed one person for the day. So you're working full-time just to afford enough food to feed yourself.
One person.
Now, if you went cheap and bought barley instead, you could feed 3 people with your one day's work. But that's still famine conditions. No other money for any other purpose.
Yeah.
No health care, no transportation, nothing. You're just working just to survive.
So the people who would take this literally would say in the last days there will be a literal famine and so on, and people starving. The spiritual interpretation would say this is another response to the gospel of spiritual famine.
Well, once again, when you drill down into the language of this horse, you keep running into spiritual stuff. And so I think the spiritual tone of the first 2 horses is maintained in the 3rd and the 4th as well.
So drill down.
So, all right. The 3rd living creature is the man. And so likely that is the one that is lying behind here. Interestingly enough, there's a famine for grain, but it says, do not harm the oil and the wine. Now, there were 3 main crops in Palestine back in those days. You had the grain, you had olives, olive trees, and you had grapevines. So the climate of Palestine is sort of a Mediterranean, California climate, and grape growing does well. Olives do real well, but also they get good wheat harvest. So you have 3 kinds of crops. Now, what's the difference between wheat olives and grapevines. Wheat is shallow rooted. So when you have a drought, when there's not enough water, the wheat will go first. The olive trees can survive a lot of drought because they go dig down deep, you see. So you have here the basic sustenance, you know, the kind of food that the poor people ate, that's in trouble. But the luxury goods, you know, the juice, the grapes, the wine, the oil, the kind of luxury stuff, that's still in strong supply. And it's interesting, there was a story that is told in ancient histories that when Domitian was emperor, and this is a different picture of Domitian than you sometimes get reading about Revelation, but when Domitian was emperor, the farmers in Asia Minor discovered that they could get more money for grapes and for olives than they could for wheat. And they could export those to Rome and get a really big price. And what was happening in Asia Minor, the poor people were starving because they couldn't afford the wine and the oil and all that stuff. That was getting exported, and the food that people needed right there was not being produced. And Domitian did an edict forcing the farmers of Asia Minor to grow more wheat so that the poor people would not starve. Now that's a pretty positive view of an emperor that's usually thought of as an ogre. That was interesting. But in that context comes this text, that the wheat is in short supply, but the olives and the grapes are in plentiful supply. So I think the original readers of this text would have found this a very natural thing.
But also, couldn't it simply mean, on like a super practical side with your analogy, is like this will affect the people that don't have deeper roots, but it will not affect those that are grounded? Like, it's a very shallow interpretation without all
No,
that.
that's
Like,
beautiful, actually. I think that's very much on the mark, that if you take a spiritual view of these things, it's saying you're having gradations here. The gospel comes, many people accept, then it's rejected. Those who reject the gospel get a shortage of it. That it's now not there. Those who were shallow-rooted end up being rejectors. And then the fourth horse, that's kind of like full-blown consequences, everything going wrong. That when you completely give up the gospel, there's addictions and strife and bloodshed and all kinds of horrible things taking place.
Do you understand this famine to be chronological after the first century? Or is it concurrent with it? If people get the gospel and then don't accept it, these things happen.
Well, when we're done with all four horses, I do want to reflect on that a bit. I think you can read these two ways. One way to read the four horses is, as you said, it's a reality for the readers, whoever reads it. The gospel's going forth.
Whatever your response to the
consequences of
gospel is.
rejection, yeah. But you could also see these somewhat chronologically through history, the way Adventists like to see them. And we can talk about that when we've gone through all four.
We've come to the end. At least we got to the third horse. Next week, we'll finish the third one and go on to the fourth. Thank you for being with us.